So now on to introductions of our keynote speaker. Keith Klain is the exec director and the head of quality management for Techmark Global Solutions. For 20 years, Keith has built software quality and test teams for global financial services and IT consulting firms in the US, UK, and Asia Pacific. He has held the role of executive VP of the Association for Software Testing and is the recipient of the 2013 Software Test Professionals Luminary Award. I've only had a brief time to get to know Keith, but immediately I got the impression of his passion for software testing and for helping to coach people. He was immediately apparent, and I think that's going to come through again once more. So please join me in welcoming Keith. Thanks.
Not the mayor, but you'll do it. Yeah. Good morning. How's everyone? Yeah? Is it early yet? All right, great. So my name's Keith. My talk today is going to be about my transition from I guess we be careful with that language these days, but my transition from the kind of buy side to the sell side in software testing. So I worked for about 20 years in what I call enterprise technology. So this is working in large financial services or insurance companies that run their own technology and software testing organizations. Make sure everyone can hear me. And some of the things that I did while I was there was, one, we did a big experiment at Barclays. I ran their global test center and used a lot of context-driven testing principles and implemented that over about 4 years. The other thing that I've worked on is do like large enterprise agile transitions, particularly in software testing, agile testing transitions, and as well did a lot of work around managing and the operational management of a testing center of excellence. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. But today I want to talk about my experience in moving from kind of owning that process to working with other clients and consulting around coaching, training, operational management, and the project work that I've done in helping organizations do those same types of work. So, y'all with me? Yeah? Doesn't matter because I'm not talking about anything else. So, just a quick word about me, where I am right now. I'm with a company called Techmark. They're a big kind of global technology consulting company. They've been around for about 30 years in the US. They do some work in the UK as well. They full service shop. I run their software testing practice, which is basically management consultancy around test automation, project work. We do outsource testing as well, but that's the kind of work that we do. And as well, they do a lot of philanthropic work, which I take a particular shine to, and work with coaching people through workforce development, and we're going to continue some of that work as well. So now on to my disclaimers. So I believe that if you're going to be aligned towards some of the context-driven testing principles, people are one of your biggest contributors to your context. And so my context is what I call enterprise technology. So these are, as I said earlier, large organizations that have a business that technology supports. Their business is not technology, but they build a lot of technology. So these are investment banks. I worked at UBS Investment Bank for 6 years. Citigroup. They do. You could probably argue in banking, can you even do banking anymore without technology? But their core business is not technology. And I think that presents a lot of interesting problems for them to solve at the kind of enterprise level. And that's particularly around, they don't always use the best methods. They don't always have the sexiest technology. The way these organizations have kind of come about, there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions. When I worked at UBS, we kind of cobbled together and stitched together about 3 organizations just during my time there. It's also heavily outsourced to vendors. They do a lot of third-party tools. They use a lot of packages. And so what that does is it creates a kind of culture and environment where it's not super ideal for a lot of the cool things that you hear about in the industry. I've worked with some companies recently where they're trying to do an agile transition, but it's almost kind of half waterfall, half agile. I've heard the word wagile being used a lot lately, where they adopt some practices, but because of the size and scope of what they're doing, the global nature of it, it makes it very difficult to get consistency or a lot of the bang for buck out of a lot of these practices. So some of the things that are particular to software testing in that context is it's heavily outsourced. So these are the organizations that have big, massive offshore testing centers, the kind of nefarious testing center of excellence. It's very commoditized. So for a long time, testing in the enterprise is really looked at as a numbers game. It's a line in a spreadsheet somewhere, and people don't understand how it's integrated into projects. And the budget is looked at as one line item, and it's cut every year. And there's a lot of impact at the program level that doesn't necessarily get reflected in the complexities of trying to run software testing in that environment. It's heavily vendorized, where you'll see, I know at Barclays, we had about 900 people with one vendor that was spread across 3 locations, and none of them sat next to our development teams, right? And who here has worked with an outsourced offshore team? Pretty much everybody, right? So there's difficulties in doing that when you look at using different practices. Are you going to be able to do continuous integration with a largely outsourced offshore team, and you want to do a 2-week sprint, and your team has got a 12-hour time zone difference? Organizations are literally having these conversations now, and to try and catch up with some of the better practices that are being used. So it's heavily commoditized. It's usually measured in different ways from development. And it's not an ideal situation if you want to improve the way testing's done. So that's what my context is. So if you work at a sexy, cool technology company like Twitter or Google or Facebook, this is not going to be the world you live in. It's not something that's built from the ground up. It's something that's developed over time and isn't necessarily ideal. So that's the world I come out of. The other disclaimer I like to make, and I used to put this slide in to kind of make fun of one individual in particular in our business, but I've realized coming into consulting that it's about me as well. And so I'll, at the risk of insulting you, I'll read it. Does everyone know who Daniel Kahneman is? If you don't, you should absolutely read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist, but wrote a book about basically how your brain works and people make decisions, and it's a great book. But what he said is, overconfident professionals sincerely believe they have expertise. They act as experts and look like experts. You'll have to struggle to remind yourself they may be in the grip of an illusion, right? And I think that's a really, really good framework to judge anybody who's giving you advice, including myself, right? So if it doesn't jar with what you're experiencing, and I think it's okay to hold people presenting themselves as experts to a higher standard. Right, we should be questioning what people are saying, and if you use that as a framework for what you're going to hear throughout the day, or any conference you attend, or anything you see on social media or talk, that's probably a pretty good framework to listen to. And the other thing that I think is a healthy tool for a tester is amount of skepticism. I think particularly as a tester, you should be constantly tuning your BS detector. Right, that's part of what's, I think, in our DNA, and that makes good testers. It's dyed in the wool. We should ask probing questions about what we're hearing. And it's okay to push back on unverified claims, particularly in the vendor space. And I, kind of famously at Eurostar, I think 5, 6, or maybe 5 years ago, before I gave my talk, I went around the expo and took a piece of paper and wrote down this was before the vendors got there, all the unverifiable claims that vendors had made through their tools, right? And I've got a particular one right now I'm kind of picking on in social media right now is a vendor that keeps putting this paper out about how to achieve bug-free software, right? And I I think that really harms our industry when people keep selling this stuff. So it's okay to push back when you hear something that doesn't make sense to you. But I think as well, and I just wanted to make this note today because it seems to come up a lot in social media. And I personally believe there's a difference between skepticism and bullying. And in context of my saying that you should hold industry professionals to a higher standard, that I think it's important, particularly through social media, you have to be very careful, like on Twitter. And there's been a lot of brouhaha lately about people being bullied on Twitter. And you can get the illusion through social media that you know someone better than you actually do. And as Martin, my friend Martin, I gave a workshop yesterday about talking about testing by not talking about testing and understanding who people are and their context. I think that's super important before you start pushing back. So my experience has been, and I've made mistakes in this in the past as well. I think from industry professionals, I'm okay with pushing back on them, but there's been times where I probably could have reined in a little bit on questioning people publicly before I've reached out to them privately. So giving people the license to challenge is okay, but we should also be kind of respectful of knowing who people are. So the other thing I like to differentiate between, and I use this a lot when I'm interviewing testers, is the differentiation between my opinion and my experience. So I've kind of cut this talk into two sections. The first one being my opinion of what I think is still kind of wrong with our industry and problems that I'm seeing through talking to clients. And that's based on observations, discussions with testers, projects work I'm doing, but there's no real science behind it, right? It's not based on any study I've done. It's my opinion of what I've observed. And so we'll get into the lessons that I've learned. Is everybody with me so far? Yeah? All right. Okay. So I left this job at Barclays, which I loved. I loved running the Global Test Center because I thought that the stuff we were doing there could be applied to multiple contexts. And so I left the job to go and start consulting with other clients. But when I started doing it, I had a very distinct feeling that came over me. And it was very difficult to describe, but it kind of felt like this. I don't know what I'm doing. Has anyone ever felt like that? Thank you for putting your hands up. Thank you. The rest of you, I know you felt like that, but thank you for putting your hands up, right? And part of the reason that I felt like that was it's very easy when you're in the kind of enterprise environment, and if anyone's worked there, it's so overburdened with operational management. I had 1,700 testers that worked for me at Barclays, and a huge chunk of my time was around comp and management and all this other stuff that you can get, I call it your uranium depleted skull to new ideas. And particularly when you're paying people to do things, it's in their self-interest to do those things when you're writing their bonus check. And you can get really insulated to that. So a lot of the things that we felt were working, when I tried to talk to other people outside of that environment, I found that wasn't necessarily ringing true with them. We say a lot, in our business that you should eat your own dog food, but when you're paying people to eat it, you're probably not going to get the most, unbiased view or review of what it tastes like. And it's also, people know what imposter syndrome is. And it's a really powerful thing, particularly in the software testing business. I run across this a lot, where really, really smart people feel like they don't know what the hell they're doing, or they don't feel like the more experience you get, the less you think you know about this business. And software testing is a relatively new business, and there's lots of stuff that's being developed and changing very rapidly, and you can feel like you don't know what to do. I guess this wasn't really a lesson, it was more of a realization on my part, but I kind of felt like dropped into, wait a minute, all these things that were working, I've got to refigure out how to actually position these with other folks. So the first real lesson that I learned, and it kind of was, again, more confirmation that I had figured out from, you guys like my highly descriptive slides? Was that, in the enterprise, and I had worked specifically with other clients who were kind of in that same size, people still aren't great at identifying, or tying testing to a quality objective or information, a piece of information on their test approach. Testing is an information-based science, right? You test for a specific reason to learn something. And there are so many clients that I had worked with, and it was roughly about, over the last couple years, just north of about 15 companies that I've done consulting work over the last couple years that still don't know why they're doing things. And at the risk of being hate tweeted right now as a Luddite, one of the biggest areas of this I've seen is in automation. And it's okay to ask, why are we going to automate this? That doesn't make you, anti-automation. And I've worked with a lot of clients, particularly a hedge fund up in Connecticut, where we had talked to their engineering team, and I had a very specific conversation with the CIO. And he said, Keith, go look at what we're doing in the automation world, and I absolutely don't want to have some big, massive regression test that just runs through a bunch of functional regression packs that we have no idea what we're learning about from this from every single run. So sit down with the engineers and ask them a very simple question. And having looked at lots of automation strategies, my first question that I ask them typically is, well, what would happen if we stopped running this? And at the risk of dating myself, you typically get the kind of RCA dog, I don't really, what are you talking about? What do you mean if we stop running this? And the engineers, when we talked to them, found out the only algorithm they were using to determine whether or not they should automate a test was if they could, right? So this isn't, I've been talking to people about this for a couple of years now. This stuff is still going on, where we're diving into, as Michael Bolton calls it, tool fetishes, where we're just literally trying to do things because we can do them. It's a very tool-based decision. There's a lot of organizations who are still, trying to use their COE and transition it to Agile, right? And that's a real thing right now, that people have got these massive offshore centers of excellences, but they want to integrate that test approach back into a 2-week sprint or implement continuous integration or deployment. And I know that sounds kind of funny or like impossible, but these people have invested lots of money in these organizations, right? And if you're not aligning, why are we doing this? If that question's not being asked, it's really easy to find massive organization structures built that don't make sense. And on top of that, our industry still isn't helpful, right? And I'm probably a very loud critic of the software testing industry. I mentioned earlier about this company right now that's constantly putting out this paper around bug-free software, but the amount of, and I like to refer to them as algorithmic defect predictinators that get sold to CIOs and COOs is still going on, and that's not helpful, So that's something that I've seen is still a big problem. And when you have that problem, it creates an environment where this is how you manage testing, right? Which is how I describe it as you're basically poking a robot with a metric stick, right? In fact, to kind of paraphrase James Bach, people don't really want a robot. What they want is like a human-skinned robot that they can put a robot into, and then that person that kind of acts like a human as a robot. So they don't really want a robot, they want a human-looking like robot. And there was a paper that came out, I think it was Gartner, about 5-6 years ago, and they interviewed, I think it was 1,000 CIOs or technology heads in Europe. And the questions were outside of your kind of normal, what are you spending on technology? What are you going to, investment up and down? They asked them how they felt about their testing organization. And it was, I could put the slide up here, but it's the same thing that's been going on for the last 25 years, which was, the testing doesn't understand our business, it's too slow, it's too expensive, and when are we finally going to be able to automate all this stuff away so I can fire all these damn people, right? That's still going on. And if you don't believe me, which as we talked earlier, skepticism is a healthy reaction to what somebody's saying. There's a paper that came out from a company I used to work with this year talking about all those exact same things, right? Not understand, like, I can send you the link to the paper, you can read it on your own. But, they're basically talking about they didn't understand how their giant outsourced relationship with their big offshore vendor had done all this automation, they managed all these metrics, and it wasn't faster, it wasn't cheaper, the headcount grew every year, and so what were they going to do? Double down on the whole approach. They were going to come up with new metrics and new automation to figure this out, right? And they didn't understand how automating all their entire regression pack didn't equate to a lower operational cost. And that's literally from the second quarter this year that this paper was published, right? And again, I'll give you another example to try and validate some of this that's not for me. Another big system integrator, one of the top 5, gave a paper this year, presented a paper this year, literally I think it was a month ago. Have you seen that hockey stick? Who hasn't drawn the hockey stick of defects cost more to fix later in the life cycle, right? We've all at some point in our career drawn that for somebody, right? Have you, whereas you go through it just goes up and it's more expensive, right? That was in there, right? And have you read the book, The Leprechauns of Software Engineering? Has anyone heard of that book? Yeah, read it, right? There's absolutely, it's by Laurent Bossiavet, is a French guy who fantastic. He researches all these little leprechauns in engineering and then debunks them, right? And goes through and finds out all the little tropes in our industry about, particularly that one, that bugs cost more. There's no science behind a lot of this stuff, right? And this organization was using it as their justification to sell their agile TCOE transition model, right? That using agile is going to reduce the cost of how much it takes you to find a defect, right? I don't even know how to do that math in my head, right? And then a quote from the paper as well, which I love. And this is current stuff that large organizations are selling. It said, the industry standard for test case design coverage, I'm just reading this to you, is between 10 to 20%. I don't even know what that means, right? Literally those words don't make sense in that order. But this is stuff that's literally going on this year, selling these ideas to people. And that's what gets sold to CIOs, COOs, people who make large decisions around your organization, and the next thing you know, you're trying to run your testing team, and then you're being told, hey, we're transitioning to Agile, and then now all your team is not there anymore, and you're back to counting test cases, right? So that's how this stuff happens, and it's still going on. So what that does, if you're not aligning, your test approach to your objectives, managing testing in suboptimal ways, what that creates is a kind of third culture, right? And it's particularly bad in enterprise COEs. And in testing as well, I think because it's a relatively new industry, we spend a lot of time renaming things or, because we're kind of pushed between two worlds, between either the development world and our business, and we're kind of navigating across the two of those. We spend too much time, I think, reinventing or renaming things. And although I agree that we should have pedantic arguments, instead of learning the language of our business, we spend too much time trying to rename things that already have a name, and not focusing our language on business value. And I've actually seen this a lot, particularly in the last year, working with organizations who want to very genuinely agile up their outsource centers. And that's a real concern and a real business driver as well. And what's happened a lot and what I've seen is that the continuous integration, continuous deployment, kind of, SDET, all testers should code meme that's out there right now has actually made this a little bit worse, because now you've got a whole group of people over the last 20 years that have basically been told, well, if you can't code, you're irrelevant. And that's created, and you've got large enterprises that have invested in the last 20 years in large teams that don't code, right? So what do we do about that? That's a real business problem. If again, to try and give you some fresh examples of this, have you all heard of the World Quality Report? Anybody here heard of world quality? I hate to advertise for this thing, but so it's a big paper that gets put out every year. I think it's by Sagetti and Capgemini and HP. And they just basically interview all their clients and then try and predict what's going to happen in the business. But there's some interesting stuff that's come out of there because you can see particularly where people are spending their money. And of the, I don't know what the number is, the interviewed companies, 50% of the enterprise organizations have a TCOE, right? And 50% of those, that same percentage, want to transition their large outsourced testing center to Agile. But ironically, the biggest threat they all identified to being able to do better coding practices, testing practices, was their vendors, because the vendors didn't want to transition to it because it blows up the paradigm of their business model, right? So that creates a culture where, you know, it's not so much about throwing it over the wall anymore, which was a big problem, I think, for a long time with testers and developers. It's now about this kind of coding hurdle of, you know, if you're not adding value, if you're not doing, you know, low-level test automation, or you can't code. And so I think a reaction to that, I have both those things, either, you know, having a kind of outsourced test approach, or this kind of you can't code, you don't belong mentality. And particularly in the context-driven testing community, and when I gave this talk earlier this year, I got, particularly in the CDT world, got hate tweeted pretty badly about this. But I think particularly in our world, that it creates what I call smarty pants syndrome, where, you know, people have really bad attitudes and push back really negatively if you question what value they're bringing. And as well, when you're teaching people to be creative and use creative or solving complex problems, you train folks how to use these techniques, right? It creates what James Bach will call the tiger cub problem, where you give people new tools and techniques and they grow claws, right? But they don't know how to kill the bunny, so they're walking around your organization just slashing everybody up, right? And I've tried to hire a lot of testers in the kind of CDT world and have actually not had a great deal of success with it because the maturity level isn't there, And I tell folks, you think of yourself not like a heart surgeon, but more like a ER doctor, right? Where you're kind of doing the MASH level meatball surgery, right? People are sick, they need help, and there's a lot of what I call passive aggressive and sometimes not so passive aggressive word correction. And you'll see I've been in conversations in that I've done some work with Paul Holland, if you know who he is. And he's horrible at it, right? I should play poker with Paul, right? Because if you say QA, he just if I say half the room, probably their spine just stiffened, Or I've been in conversations with him, with clients where they're talking about testing, but they're calling it QA. And then he just corrects himself, well, when are we going to test that? Well, when we give it to QA. Yep, is the test team going to have it? Well, after they're done QAing it. And it's this back and forth that frankly just pisses everybody off. All right, and so I think we need to do a better job of bringing people into the community and teaching people not necessarily how to pick their battles, but communicate differently about things and understanding who people are. So, does everybody know what this is? Or who that is? Yes, it's Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. So, when they first summited Everest, right? What there's that "you are here" line, right? What that's now called the Hillary step, right? But when they first summited, it was just known as a 40-foot sheer rock face. So Everest is roughly about 29,000 feet. At about 28,000 feet is a 40-foot sheer rock face. So when they first got there, and they weren't, using all the kind of sexy crampons and, the ice falls or ladders and all this other stuff you see now, where you can summit Everest if you use a Stairmaster for a year. So they got to the top of that, and you can just imagine 40-foot sheer rock face. No one's been up there before. They get to the top, and what's there? It's the summit. No, it's not. It's another 1,000 feet of flat drudgery. And if anyone's ever done any kind of mountaineering, once you get above kind of 10,000 feet, just every step is oxygen depleted pain, right? And so they had another 1,000 feet of very flat unknown to get to the actual summit, right? And that's how a metaphor I use to describe a career in software testing. So sounds like you might commiserate with that a little bit. So I've used this a lot with training new software testers to give them the idea of there's a lot of stuff new in our industry. You're going to work really hard on something, and then wait a minute, the ground's shifted, things have changed. Oh, we used to call that this. If you've been around long enough, Agile, people like to call it rapid application development, DSDM, the rational unified process. It all had trying to do short iterations of delivery to our clients. It's had multiple, life cycles if you've been around long enough. And that not everything is going to be as simple as it seems. And as soon as you think you figured something out, well, that's actually was just the top of the 40-foot sheer rock face. Now you've got another 1,000 feet to actually learn how to apply it. And I use that a lot to shepherd new testers into the business, but I didn't realize that it actually was most poignant for me, that coming out of the corporate world into working in consulting, that was really more about me than anybody else. So I'm now with everyone else and trying to figure this stuff out. So now I'm going to move on to what I've seen works in trying to combat some of these lessons so I don't continually relearn them, all right? I mean, again, this is based on my experience in working with clients and translating those lessons. So the first one, is, and I've talked a lot about this before, about combating poor objectives, is if you can't draw a direct line between you, your test approach, and the business, I personally feel like you're doing it wrong, right? You should be able to be able to articulate the information that you're gaining from your tests and how it is helping mitigate some level of risk to your business. And I think that should be a lens through which you're constantly refocusing your work, right? And that's part of a tester's job. And I can't remember the gentleman's name who gave me this piece of advice, but I've given it and passed it on a lot, and I think it's really good. So does anyone work here for a publicly traded company? Yeah, a few? Well, if you're not, you probably work for a company that has a CFO, right? And so you're either privately held and they've got investors, or you're publicly held. If you're publicly held, you can go out, and I guess I should know what the Canadian equivalent of the SEC is, but in the US we have the SEC, and your company every year has to provide what's known as a Form 10K, which is basically a report to the SEC that lists all the threats to their business, their strategy, competitors. It is what I call a target-rich environment for testing ideas. So there's lots of great stuff that you should be able to help mitigate risk for your business. But as well, if you listen to your investor calls, which, if you just want to learn about your business, that it's a great thing to do. But your CFO is going to be asked questions by analysts, reporters, media people. And the piece of advice I got was figure out through your test approach or your strategy how to help your CFO answer those questions they get asked on those calls, right? Again, those are great ideas to add to user stories, however you're managing, the product development, right? Another great piece of advice I give people is I used to do this at Barclays. I'd go visit our center in India and ask people what I call the critical defect test. So if our CEO came in and asked you, stand up and tell me the last critical defect you found and what its impact would have been to the line of business you're testing for, right? Stand up now. I'm joking, you don't have to stand right now. But if you can't answer that question, right, I personally, my opinion is I don't think you're thinking about why you're testing in as clear a way as you could, right? Testing is an information-based service, right? And it's a service, it's not a servant to a project. It's a service, and you should be providing objective information. It's a real slippery slope, particularly in a lot of the kind of agile groups that I've seen recently, that everybody does everything. Well, where's the objectivity or review of what we're doing coming from? And I think a tester with that tester hat on should be providing a lot of that. Objectivity as a tester is not just a good practice, it's your responsibility, right? And a tool for using that, and if you didn't do Martin and I's workshop yesterday where we confused the hell out of 20 people for a whole day, one of the topics that we talked about, and I personally believe that if you want to talk to your CIO about testing, you should absolutely not talk to a CIO about testing, right? And I used this example yesterday that one of the heuristics for me as someone who managed testing in the enterprise is that if my CIO was asking me about testing, I was doing a bad job. I don't want to talk to them about testing. I want to talk to them about the business, threats to value, projects, how we're adding value to the organization. And there's this idea of interactional expertise. And if you haven't, I'm not going to go through Harry Collins and all his work with tacit and explicit knowledge. And I think he was a contributor to Trading Zones. Great books you should absolutely read. But the way to think about interactional expertise, which particularly if you're managing testing, is that expertise is on a continuum. And on one end, you've got kind of beer mat, and I'm going to use this example for the last time because I got really, a lot of looks of people didn't know who Cliff Clavin was. So the last talk I had, all these damn millennials didn't know who he was. So, but kind of, a little about a lot of things. It's kind of very shallow knowledge. On one end is this kind of beer mat knowledge. And on the other end of the continuum, you are literally contributing to the science. And you're kind of like right at moving things forward. You're doing experiments. You're kind of at the center of the science. And interactional expertise is, and again, at the risk of insulting you, it's expertise in the language of a specialism in the absence of expertise in its practice. And I think it's not a long book, you should absolutely read it, but it's learning the language of our business so that we can help articulate that into test ideas. And as well, I can talk to a sales trader about equity derivative products, but I'm not a sales trader, right? It helps them also gain confidence in that I understand their business and can help test on their behalf or get them better information. And I think it's more important for, instead of testers creating our own language, for us to learn how to communicate in other languages. And that combats a lot of the confusion around what a testers do and how to add value. The other piece of advice I give people, and this is particularly around trying to combat, taking a few less lashes off the metric stick, is that test management, right, is 80% hands-on testing. And that number usually throws people for a loop. And I'll give you an example that the 1,700 testers that I managed at Barclays, I had 5 full-time managers. Everybody below that tested at least 80% of the time. And that's not just, and so there's some things I throw into hands-on testing that traditionally aren't included in that, but that's things like, pair testing with people, coaching, right, mentoring. This is people helping get better at testing, better in their career, right, and actually just doing some hands-on testing. And I think one of the banes that I've railed against in our industry is this idea of an operational test manager. Or I lovingly referred to them at UBS as the coloring in boys, right? So these are people who their whole job is metric scorecards. They're managers of managers. I think more than anything else in our business, that has undermined our value to stakeholders. And that if you're not doing a lot of actual hands-on testing, the likelihood of your job going away is probably fairly high. But also, you're getting into the meat of projects. You should be doing that. And unfortunately, in large enterprises, typically the barometer for how well you're doing is how far away you get from actually doing anything. Right? That makes sense? Right? The more you move up, the more management you do, the less you're actually valued. And I worked with a client last year where some of their best testers, people who had really deep system knowledge and they were going through a really nasty integration with a company they had just bought, were literally spending 90% of their time in meetings instead of actually doing testing. And when I presented that to the COO who hired us to do the review, they were like, what the hell is going on? These people should actually be helping lead these projects. But it's a real slippery slope to go down. So in regards to COEs, this is my best advice I could give you on that. So if you're working in the enterprise and you have to work with these, my advice would be to try and maintain a 30-70 percentage for in-house to outsourced. So 30% of your team would potentially be outsourced. 70% of your team should be employees. And I know that is wild. It's usually the other way around. And I'm working with a client right now, actually, who's at the 90-10 mark, where 90% of their staff is outsourced and offshored, and 10% is kept in-house. And you can imagine how effective those people are who are, sitting in the U.S. managing, 100 people offshore, and that kind of intermediary model kicks in. But my advice is keep your outsourced staff number to around the 30% mark. 60-40 maybe could work, but I try and keep it around 30. And my advice on doing a COE is absolutely not to do one. I've been sold them multiple times from vendors, and that the only thing I've seen as a result of them is confusion and pain and suffering. And so my advice is not to do a COE. But if you are in the midst of running a COE, you have one, the next piece there is refocus it often, right? And that means realign it continually with business objectives, right? The other thing I would say in regards to testing is it should not have any special metrics. And I've been asked, 1,000 times when we were at Barclays, well, how did you measure your teams? How did you, what scorecards did you produce? And we did none of it. We didn't manage any metric scorecards because the question I asked continually to our project and program managers was, how are you managing or measuring your developers or business analysts or project managers in the same way? If once you tell me that, then I'll contribute to that. But if your testing shouldn't have a separate set of metrics, I think that creates another divide that only causes confusion for people. And the last piece I'll give on this is when I was running the group with Barclays, we had absolutely no vendor management involved. Right, and they continually complained that, and what I mean, we didn't have any management from them. They literally didn't have access cards to our center in India. They had to get permission to come into our center. We aligned their objectives with our objectives. I helped manage their careers, and I got a lot of complaints from the vendor that their team felt more like Barclays employees than their own team, and that's exactly what I wanted to have happen. Because one of the big problems with outsourced vendors is that you're actually a competitor to their people, right? So a lot of these folks have career paths that are internal that don't necessarily line up with your objectives as an organization. So my advice is to keep middle management away. So combating smarty pants syndrome, and this is, again, homage to my friend Griffin there with the good doctor up there. We can never be sure we're right. We can only be sure that we're wrong. Coming at, again, thinking of yourself more as an ER doctor and not as a general practitioner, correcting language and having allergies to certain words generally doesn't get the result that you want. Even if you think that it is, they're just mad at you, they're not telling you, right? I think people know who Ben Simo was. He tweeted something the other day about, sometimes there's a difference between imposter syndrome and just being an imposter, right? And we should be working to gain understanding with people as opposed to constantly trying to correct them. Because, the longer I do this, the less I feel like I actually know anything about this. So I would approach, trying to gain understanding with my clients as a tester. One, looking at it from a position of humility, not knowing that I don't know everything, making sure that when we're making decisions about our test approach or strategy, they understand that and that we're being context aware. And it's amazing to me how many people align towards the context-driven testing community, and the first thing they ignore is the actual context. It's not a series of practices or techniques or tools. It's a kind of paradigm to look at things through. And the first thing we ignore is the actual people that are involved in our context. So, and the last thing I would give you as a piece of advice, and I give this to a lot of people, is manage your own expectations, right? It's a very tough business we're in. I wrote a article earlier this year for if you haven't read Testing Trapeze. It's a great online magazine, and I wrote an article for about how strange this business is. And one of the things that I learned this year particularly is that, this is hard. The testing business is hard, and the problem we're trying to solve of kind of staring into the abyss of ambiguity and unknown is not easy, and to do it hard takes a lot of skill and work and training. So manage your expectations that it's going to be a difficult journey, but that a lot of these things can be overcome. So with that, I'm done. Did you want to, is there questions, or I don't know what happens now. Any questions? Or you can just stare at me in stunned silence. Uh-oh. Of course. Okay, I'll repeat your question for the folks online. Go ahead.
So you talked about being 80% hands-on testing as management. How does that kind of fit into the typical kind of career progression path, right? Like you said, tends to be moving towards, further away from what you're actually doing. So have you got any thoughts or ideas on career progression with that attitude at play?
In like what that career path should be?
Or could look like, yeah.
Yeah, and I think you can take on more responsibility in the larger teams. I don't know how you manage more than maybe 20 people in any kind of effective way. But you can manage programs of work. And what I looked at as, one of the things I did at Barclays when I took over there was we kind of blew up the role title. So we literally had 3 roles: a test analyst, a test lead, and a test manager. And what I focused more on was comp. So as they got better and progressed more, I could pay them more and make sure they were market rate, but not get so hung up on titles. So we had people there with 15 years of experience who were still called a test analyst, right? And I think that in my experience has been people are more hung up on the money aspect of it, that I don't want to be called a test lead because if I look at the market, the test lead only makes a certain amount of money. So I would focus, if you're in that position with management, on the kind of comp aspects of it, and all the noise around titles and career progression go away. Again, in the enterprise, there is a lot of hierarchy and structure, and I was fortunate to be able to work with HR directly on managing our career tracks. So I would look at it that way, and probably focus more on interesting work than necessarily what my title was. Are you going to ask a question, Albert? Let me brace myself first.
Okay, so as I captured lesson number 4, and I'm quoting, hiring CDT people didn't turn out so great. So my question is twofold. First, can you comment on that, expand a bit, and what did turn out great if you had any good experience?
Yeah, so you got to be careful, because the last time I got severely misquoted on this on Twitter and got flamed for a week. so as a paraphrase of what I said, it was difficult to find people in the context-driven testing community that were good test leads. And in my definition, a test lead is somebody who's managing either a project or a specific interaction with a business, a stakeholder. And I found that to be very difficult to find people. And some of the reasons were they got hung up on words. They didn't have a maturity level to help people, right? They said, look, here's the worldview, right? And if you're not congruent with that worldview, well then what the hell's wrong with you, right? And didn't approach things from a kind of, a perspective of humility and self-awareness of how they're contributing to the communication breakdown, and didn't have, if you look at consulting particularly, you have to have a long view, and I think that particularly when you're trying to improve things and people burn out on this quickly, is well, this is such a good idea, why don't you like it? I'm just going to keep hitting the reset button on my career until I find a place that really gets me, right? And you see a lot of people that do that instead of, what's the phrase, the biggest, or the only common denominator in all your dysfunctional relationships is you, right? And people, I had a hard time finding folks that did that. In fact, I found it easier to grow them than to find them. I don't know if that remotely answered your question, but. Yeah, I found difficulty in finding them. It was probably easier to coach and train them. Oh, we got a question here. Oh boy. Hi,
Good
Karen.
morning. Hi, Keith.
It's always great when you get a question from the other keynote.
So actually, I don't have a question, but I do want to just make a comment and say thank you. That was great, and I appreciate you talking about some of the bullshit that happens in our field. And probably there's no questions because some of it's a little uncomfortable, right? And you've kind of looked at a couple of topics just square on. So there's at least a good number of people in the room who probably know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you. Oh. Any other questions? Or is Karen that I actually no more questions. That was How are we doing on time? Yeah? Is that good? All right, thank you very much.